Welcome to Video Module 4 in the Simulation-Based Planning and Scheduling course. The module focuses on task sequences. You can note from the titles, Task Sequences 1, this is a very broad topic. There's a lot of detail associated with task sequences, so we will definitely revisit this topic in future modules. In Video 1, we will focus on the module objectives and then building an initial model. And so the specific objectives is that we want to use task sequences in a scheduling-based model. And we're starting with a model from our last lecture, which is class 4. And we'll incorporate simple setup and cleanup operations to the part sequences using task sequences. So if you haven't seen that module previously, I suggest that you go back and watch that before you watch this module. We'll then incorporate secondary resources for the individual tasks in our task sequences. And then finally, we will use table-based approach for defining tasks and the associated secondary resources in our task sequence. So our initial task sequence model, we're going to start with the job shop model that we developed in the lecture number 4, as I said, and that lecture module was based on a template that we developed in the previous video module, video module 3. And the model is completely data generated and data driven. And our goal is to add setup and cleanup tasks using task sequences. So let me pull that model up and we'll just talk about that for just a little bit. So here's our model, and you can see that we have three stations, S1, S2, S3. And this is a flexible flow line in that parts flow in the same direction, and that it's flexible in the sense that they have different processing times on the stations and not all parts visit all stations. And so it's defined, as I said, it's data generated. So we have a resources table where we use auto create instance to create the objects. We have a parts table, which is connected to our sequence table and our orders table. And so we've seen all of this previously. And so we have this base model that we want. And what we want to incorporate is this notion of setup and cleanup. And so we have, if you recall our processing times, we use the processing time for each part defined in the sequence times the number of parts in the specific order. And so that's sequence P time times order quantity. And what we want to incorporate is when an order comes to S1, we want to incorporate a time required to set up the operation. And then when the order completes, we want to incorporate time to clean up after that operation. Now, the ones that we're going to do in this video, the setup and cleanup operations that we're going to do in this video are very simple. We're not going to consider sequence-dependent setups or changeovers. Everything is going to be completely sequence-independent. And we're going to implement this with a very straightforward 3 sequential task sequence. However, the general methodology that we'll use in developing this model is equally applicable to arbitrarily complex task sequences. So recall from our previous model that we have the resources table that defines the individual resources, the object instances used in the model. Then we have a part table that defines the parts, a sequence table that defines the sequence of operations, and then, as I said, the orders table which defines orders for particular parts and in particular quantities. And so these relationships between the part, which is the primary key of parts, and the order is what ties an order to a part, and then between the primary key and parts and the foreign key and sequence defines the sequence of operations. Now, note that there's also kind of an indirect tie between the sequence and resources, because recall that the destination is the input node from one of the resources. But for this particular model, we didn't formalize that relationship, but it's clearly there informally. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add our 2 times, our setup time and our cleanup time, to our sequence so that we can define for each individual step, for each individual part, the corresponding setup and cleanup time. And once we have those defined in the table, we will then define task sequences so that the original processing time that we had is right here in task 20, and it will be preceded by a setup and then succeeded by a cleanup. And so this is the task sequence that we will implement. 3 sequential steps. Step 10 is a setup, step 20 is a process, step 30 is the cleanup. We'll also see that our setup and cleanup operations are both conditional. So if we don't have a setup, so for example, if the setup time for a particular operation is 0, then we don't want this task to occur. Similarly, if the cleanup time is 0, then we don't want this task to occur. So these two, as we will see when we do the implementation, will end up being conditional, and the middle one, process, will not be conditional. In other words, it will always execute regardless of the execution of either the setup or the cleanup. All right, so let's get started with these additions. So here's our base model. As I said, go back to our data, and we look at the individual parts, and then, as I said, the sequence table defines the sequence for a given part. And so what I want to do is go in my sequence table, in addition to my processing time, I'm going to add 2 additional expression properties, one for setup time, one for cleanup time. So I'm going to choose expression, and I'm going to say setup time, and then I'll go and say I want to make this time unit, so I'm going to make it consistent with the processing time, which we did in minutes. So there's my setup time. And then I'll add my second one, which is cleanup time, and make it consistent also. So we will make this units time, unit type time, and units minutes. So there we go. Then I'm going to arbitrarily define some of these. So let's just say we have a 30-minute setup, 15-minute cleanup for that operation, maybe a 50-minute setup, 10-minute cleanup for this operation. Let's say that we have no setup here, and I don't know, 30 minutes here. And for part B on S1, let's say this is a longer one, 60 minutes, and then maybe, I don't know, a short 10-minute cleanup. Let's say we have no setup here, 20 minutes setup here. So again, I'm just making all these up, and you can see what I'm doing is I'm trying to equally, set up some that have both setup and cleanup, some that just have setup, some that just have cleanup. For this one, we'll say that one has nothing. So for part B, it has 3, there's nothing. Then we have, I don't know, 30 minutes here, no cleanup, and then we'll just do a last cleanup here of 45 minutes. I don't know. So basically what we're saying is if I go back to my part now and look at my sequence, we can say that for part A, it has a 30-minute setup, 15-minute cleanup at S1. Then it goes to S2 and has a 50-minute setup and a 10-minute cleanup. Then it goes to S3 and there's no setup and there's no cleanup. So you can see, and I just made those up, by the way. So there's no rhyme or reason for that other than I want to have some different situations here. Okay, so we now have our data defined. The next step is to go and define the task sequences. So I'm going to start here with S1. So let me just make that a little bit bigger, choose S1, and then over here you can see we have our process type and our processing time. And we're just going to choose our process type and switch to task sequence. And now you can see that says, okay, we have processing tasks, which we have these 0 rows, so this is clearly a repeat group. You can see the ellipsis here. So let's open the repeat group here, drag this window onto the screen. There we go. And we're going to add our 3 tasks. So remember, we have 3 tasks in sequence, so we're just going to use kind of the default numbering system of 10, 20, 30. We're going to name our task, so this is going to be our setup. As I said, a task setup and cleanup are conditional. So just going to click on the conditional, and now we have a condition or probability. Our condition is based on our sequence. Sequence setup time is greater than 0. If that's true, then this task will execute, and I want the time to be determined from the sequence table also. Sequence setup time. There we go. And so that's all we need to have. So we have a conditional task called setup, which uses, and where the condition is sequence setup greater than 0. If that condition is true, then we're going to execute the task of setup time. Our second task is process. So I need to update the sequence number so they are in series rather than in parallel. This is process. And for this one, we want it to always execute. So there's no condition here. And we will set the process time to sequence p time. Now, one more thing we have to do here is this auto cancel trigger. And so auto cancel trigger is a setting where you can say if the immediate predecessors are canceled, then cancel this one. So if you go back to our, let's see, our task sequence here. Let me see if I can get to it. Oops, there's our task sequence. What this is saying is if we don't execute this one, in general, the way task sequences are defined, I might want to cancel everything after that. So it might be that this task is conditioned for the entire sequence. In our case, it's not. In our case, what we want is if this one doesn't execute, we still want this one to execute. And so that's why we need to make this setting all to none rather than all immediate. What was the verbiage there? All immediate predecessors canceled, right? So we want that to be none. And then finally, we'll add our third task. Third task here is cleanup. And it's going to also be conditional. And so the condition here is sequences or sequence cleanup time is greater than 0. Oops, I guess I didn't spell that right. Sequence cleanup time greater than 0. We want it to be a specific time, and we want it to be sequence cleanup. And for this case, we don't have to set the auto cancel trigger because it only, for this particular task sequence, there's only one immediate predecessor, and that's process. And because process is always executed, there's no chance that it will be canceled. So we don't need to make that adjustment. Okay, so we defined it again, and keep note that we defined our tasks using a repeat group. And so in the third video in this module, we will revisit that and look at using, rather than using a repeat group defined here, within the object instance, we will move that to a table. But for now, let's focus on this one. Okay, so we have S1. S1 is now defined using the task sequence. So before we deal with the station 2 and 3, let's go have a look at the results from station 1. So we go back to our planning tab and note that we see that, the red banner here that says, okay, you've changed the model since this was last run. So I'm going to go back to operational planning and recreate the plan. And when we look at it now, it doesn't really look much different, right? It doesn't look much different because we haven't shown the task. So if I just expand that, we can see that we have our setup here. If you just scroll on the task, you can see we have process cleanup, process setup cleanup. So our setups, our process look awful small. So I'm going to go back and recheck those. I think I know what I did. I think I didn't multiply by the quantity. Yeah, let's go take a look at that. Oh yeah, here we are. So when I did sequence.p time, what that's saying is use the processing time for a single part. But of course, we need to multiply that by orders quantity. And so since I now have an expression here, I have to make sure that I use minutes. Before, when I didn't have an expression, when I just had an individual value, it assumed the units, but here I have to specify that. Okay, so let's go back and recheck our planning. So let's go back, go and say, let's create the plan. Okay, now this looks a little bit better. So our processing times are quite a bit bigger. And so now you can see in our tasks, here's our setup, here's our process, here's our cleanup. For that task. Here's our setup and our process and our cleanup for that task. Here for order 3, we have a setup and a process, but no cleanup. So if we go back and look at order 3 is for part C. So go back and look at our part C sequence, and sure enough, there's no cleanup here. And so you can go back and do this kind of evaluation. This is part of our ongoing verification process to make sure it's behaving like you want. So that's one of the reasons I just made sure that some of the tasks had both setup and cleanup. Other tasks had just cleanup. Other tasks had neither, so that we could go back in and do the evaluation. So back in our facility view, of course, we set that for S1. We defined the part sequence or the task sequence for S1. Now we need to do the same thing for S2 and S3. And at this point, we have options for how to do that. One way that we could do that is I could go back in and define the task sequence for S2 and S3 the exact same way that I did for S1. I could go in to the process type, set it to processing task, do the repeat group and all of that, and that would work just fine. In this case, I'm not going to do that, though. Instead, what I'm going to recognize is that I've used this custom object, JS server for job shop server that we developed before. And so all of these are of that type. And so when I look at my S1, now we see task sequence in this repeat group, the 3 rows are bold, meaning that we have changed from the default. Go to S2, and now that's not bold, so that specific time that was still tied to the table, so sequence P time orders quantity, came from the initial job shop template. Okay, and so what we want to do is I'm just going to go to S1 and right click and say I want to update the JServer property defaults from this. And so again, what that's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm going to take all of these property values and make those the default for the object that lives in the project library. And now the first thing you see is that task sequence and 3 rows are no longer bold because now they are the default. And if I go look at S2, it's automatically been changed because those were at their defaults before, and so it just keeps them at the defaults even though the defaults have changed. And then we go to S3 and see that also. So go back and look at our planning view. Let's just reset it and rerun it. And now if we expand, okay, I'm going to do one thing here. I'm going to, click that, and then I'm going to go to my Gantt chart view, and I'm just going to get rid of my constraints, right? And so note here that I can just change the visibility so that we don't see all of those constrained entities. So in this particular data set, everything arrived at time 0. Since it's a flexible flow line, when we look at our constraints, of course, everything is waiting here in front of the first server in the flow line. So I'm going to look at that, and then now that we've expanded for S2, we can see a setup, a cleanup, then we can see a process with no setup but a cleanup, then a setup, process, cleanup, and so on. And so we can see for S1, S2, and S3, we've now implemented that logic where based on the table data, if the value is greater than 0 for setup, then it incurs a setup. The setup task executes. Otherwise, it moves immediately to the process task. And then after the process task, if there's a cleanup time, it implements that task. And so you can see it's a very straightforward process. Again, all we did in this model is we defined our 3 task sequence on S1, and then we updated the properties. And so what let us do that, again, is that we were using these custom objects. Had I started out with a server, just a base server object, it wouldn't be that simple. I would have to go back in and create a new object or set the individual task sequences manually. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If we're not using custom objects, that's the process that we follow. It still works equally well. So if I had used 3 servers here, I could still do that process. I would just have to add the task sequences. Also note that when we updated the defaults, the implication is that each one of the servers acts the exact same way. So if this one has the 3 task sequence, this one has the 3 task sequence, this one has the 3 task sequence with the same values. That's not necessarily true in all cases. So the individual servers can have different task sequences. So you can have, maybe this one has 3 tasks sequentially, maybe this one has some parallel tasks, right? So they don't all have to be the same. It just so happens that in this simple model, we wanted to start out with them all being the same so that we could just sort of demonstrate how that process works. And finally, notice that other than the planning tab where we can actually see these tasks, so I can actually see the breakdown here. If I open the task view, I can see the breakdown. The behavior here is really no different than had I gone in and not used task sequences, but just used an expression for the total time. So in other words, I could go back here and say, I have my process time, I have my setup time, I have my cleanup time. I could have a simple processing time expression where I say, setup time, plus P time times quantity plus cleanup time. If I built that expression, then if I don't have a setup, the time will just go to 0. So I could just as easily have set that without using task sequences. So in this particular case, the only thing the task sequences do is let us see that on the planning view. In the next video, we're going to change that a little bit, and we're going to introduce the notion of secondary resources, where we say, well, one reason I want to have this kind of structure is suppose that the setup and the cleanup require secondary resources, like a different operator, right? Then it becomes very difficult to implement without using task sequences, and so that's why we wanted to introduce the task sequences first in a very simple model, and then in the next video we will add secondary resources, and then in the third video we will look at doing a table structure.